Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name's Patrick Norris, and I am so excited to continue our conversation about parenting your kids' sexuality. This has been such an amazing discussion. We started last time in part one, really digging down on a lot of different nuances, different pieces of what parents deal with in even trying to think through parenting a child's sexuality. And today we pick back up with Dr. Todd Bowman. And for those of you that don't know who he is, let me reintroduce him again. He is a psychologist and behavioral neuroscientist. He's the associate professor of counseling at Indiana Wesleyan University. He's an adjunct professor of human sexuality at Nazarene Theological Seminary and an adjunct professor of the intro psychology at Nazarene Bible College. He's an author and editor of Reclaiming Sexual Wholeness, and he is one of our very favorite people. He's one of our fellows of the Red Ink Revival. He's married to Rebecca for 17 years. He's got 3 kids, and today we're going to talk about stuff like porn, masturbation, LGBTQ issues, birth control for teenagers, and a whole lot more. So you're going to want to stay for the entire time. Dr. Bowman, great to have you in the house again.
Absolutely. I'm excited about today's conversation. Certainly where we left off in our last episode, time together, was very powerful for me. Just appreciated the space to be real with parents, and I'm looking forward to continuing that sense of realness as we tackle hard topics in our time together today.
I love it. I love it. Well, in review for last time, we talked about how important it is as a parent to, first of all, be engaged with the sexual discipleship of your children, to actually be a mentor in their life. We talked about how that there are silent environments in homes where it's never talked about. There's saturated environments where it's populated. Then you have the conflicted environment, which is what churches often, or church families have, where there's this tension between and good and evil and sin and et cetera. And then there's the intentional environment where we begin to really work through it. We said that it's never too late to parent. It's never too late. So if we're just starting, it's still a great thing to do. We also said that it's important that parents really come to a self-awareness to where they land on things that are sin and what sin is and what the threat level of that is in the way they metabolize it. We talked about how that when a person is, they're entering into this mentoring deal, they're trying to imagine what that could look like. If they don't know the areas of sin and what they think of sin just as a topic, then you narrow it down to, is porn a sin? Is it not a sin? What's the difference in porn as a sexually arousing thing versus the artistic, the David statue and him being nude? Is that art? What's the difference in all that? All the way into masturbation and nocturnal emissions. And then we get into issues of LGBTQ and what do we think and feel about that, and then the birth control issues with teenagers who might be experimenting, and we hope that they're not, but they might be, and if they are. So we've got so many areas here that we want to dig into, but clearly it is important that as a parent we know where we land. And so let's launch from there. Sure. Of the importance of knowing where you land on these ideas. How important is it that a parent know it?
Yeah, I think it's critical. I mean, really, the foundation for how we're stewarding our kids' sexuality is rooted in A, what is our story? B, how attuned to our story, the experiences we've had sexually that populate our development. And C, how resolved are they? Are there still wounds that are bleeding in us? Is there shame that's attached to those things? Is there fear? Is there pain? How might the lack of resolution to that part of our story, unbeknownst to us, be driving how we're thinking about our kids, the conversations we are having, or maybe the conversations that we're not having with them? So to me, it's just critical. It's foundation level stuff to really be aware of our sexuality, our story, our development, our theology, our understanding of sin as we're trying to walk out really crucial conversations with our kids around human sexuality.
I think it's interesting because this whole idea of the word sin, it's just got so much atomic particle in it. And people will spin with different emotional reactions just to the word. So in today's global population, if a Christian were to say something sin, I had a conversation with one of our colleagues that is a non-Christian, brilliant person, somebody I admire. And I was actually asking them to be a part of our podcast, to interview them on an area that they're great at. And they wanted to interview me first in private and ask some questions around what I believed about various things, and said that they would not be able to be on the podcast as a guest if I believed certain things. And so I said, what are you exactly asking? They use the word inclusive. I just want to make sure you're inclusive. And then, I want to make sure that there isn't anything that could be perceived as bigotry. And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what they're asking. So I go to it. I said, well, what are you asking? I said, let me just tell you how I experience my interaction with the biblical text. And I said, my experience with the biblical text is that, and I would qualify what those things are, and then I would say that in wrestling with the text, I come away believing the text to be true to it says that something is a sin. So are you saying that that now means that I am non-inclusive to those people who are actively in that particular behavior? And they came back with the answer of, well, that is the definition of bigotry. That is the definition of non-inclusive. And I said, so if you're saying that that's the definition, then I guess that that's how you're going to experience me. I said, but that's not my heart, because the reality is that every human is navigating sin. Every human. And the fact that you call something a sin does not mean they're less than. It can mean that somebody has chosen to live in a pattern that I might believe that is going to create dysfunction, disorder, and pain in their life. That by choosing to live in that lifestyle or that pattern, or what the scripture might use the phrase, manner of life, that if they live in that manner of life, it's going to create enough pain in their life that God actually hates the sin because He loves us as humans. And it doesn't matter who you are, God loves you as a human. And so to call that out and then to be told that I'm non-inclusive or that I'm a bigot, it's interesting because what I could have flipped, but that wasn't the context. I kept it in a very gracious space. We left that being able to disagree. But here's the reality. That person was being non-inclusive and a bigot to me.
Yeah, that's where my mind went automatically.
Yeah.
Wow, this is interesting.
Yeah, that because you have an opinion, we can't just disagree and hold on to ourselves. The disagreement now then, if I see something with a different interpretation than you do, that now then we are at odds. Well, parents are dealing with this every day in the workplace.
Absolutely.
Every day in schools. Kids are dealing with it every day in schools. The media, everything is putting an entire narrative of what we are supposed to believe and blend into. And if we don't, there's something wrong with us. So talk to that.
Well, which is really interesting. And I kind of get on my soapbox and get some emotional charge in this conversation, not even around the homosexuality issue or human sexuality issue broadly defined, but rather the sense that this, hopefully not waxing too philosophical here, but the idea of relativism.
Yeah.
Right, like that we've transcended postmodernity, like we exist in a relativistic philosophical framework where every truth is okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then yet, as you try and raise a child according to biblical precepts, things that have long since, for thousands of years, been identified as sinful.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about human sexuality, so anything pertaining to human sexuality.
Yeah.
Right? Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, if we want to look at those, which we can double back to that. I think there's a lot more going on in Leviticus 18 and 20, these kind of sexual ethic chapters of Leviticus that we've got to make sense of. But this relativistic moral framework that our kids are being raised in, where every truth is equivalent and every truth is okay. And then, right, like if you select a truth that's more rooted in the biblical narrative, right, that is rooted in maybe modernity philosophically, or is rooted in, right, universal truth.
Right.
Right, like all of a sudden there's a problem with that.
Yeah.
Even though, to your point about your interaction with this colleague, right, like, that's what happened. Like
Yeah.
it's the nonsense. It doesn't apply. It doesn't follow, right? Like how can you accuse me of something and then do the same thing
To me,
and it's okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's so much of the social space that parents find themselves in as they're trying to raise kids, because there's so much weight, and I'd have to go and look and see how does the kind of history of social media maybe inform how we think and perceive and interact with conformity to others' expectations or demands. Does the social world now have more weight than it used to because we know what's happening around the world 24/7 instead of just staying in our lane and tending our flock as you and I, dads for moms, right? There's just so many more variables that pollute the context of parenting. And we're worried about what are people saying, thinking, or doing. How are my kids going to navigate this, instead of really anchoring ourselves in what is God's heart? What is God's desire? What is God's plan? And how do we prioritize that? How do we, as families and parents, live into that as our first and foremost drive and desire?
Yeah. It's interesting because we lose our sense of self. We fail to differentiate for who I am and who you are whenever in our modern societies and cultures where we disagree. If we disagree because your opinion's different than mine, I then process that down as though you're hating on me. And which means that I have to be a codependent. I have to be enmeshed with all my relationships to not be able to say, I'm okay. And if you think that I hate you because of the experience of my disagreement, then I have to say, well, it's interesting. And in differentiation, I can look at you and say, oh, I wonder why you would go to an emotional state of hate. I wonder what happened in your life that would come to pass. When you were bringing up the idea of postmodernism, and I just want to say to all the parents that postmodernism is not something that just kind of showed up and then somebody threw a definition. It is an aggressive, intentional philosophy that's been formalized in various ways to get into our schools, our universities, and today we are past post-modernism. We're in what is formalized as the name post-truth. And post-truth is that now we live in experience. We live in emotion. So if we are living in post-truth, we are more aware of historical oppressive kind of roles and relationships, and then it's all experiencing, and whoever has the greatest or deepest wounds and experience in the oppressive relationship, they're now the authority of truth. So truth is not now objective. Truth is based on the relativism of experience. And so as a parent, I just want to acknowledge, no wonder it's so hard for a parent to land on what they believe.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're being pulled and some people, if their beliefs were made known, they would lose their jobs, they would lose their credibility, they could lose their networks. There's so much risk there.
Right.
That's where it begins, and then we bring it down into, okay, now how do I parent my kids? And so as a dad, how do you navigate that? You're a psychologist. How you construct ideas as a Christian, as a believer, but you're also in the public sector as an expert. How do you navigate all that to be able to parent well with your kids?
Yeah. Well, I think for me personally, and everybody's probably going to navigate this space and this conversation a little bit differently, but Patrick, there's been professional opportunities that I've self-selected out of. Leadership in national and international organizations, collaborating with specific universities, not because they've said like, oh, wait a minute, but because I've said, like I recognize the narrative, I recognize the conformity, I've got enough insight into those systems to say, like how much compromise am I okay with?
Yeah.
And for me, I've been blessed with the opportunity, you read off kind of embarrass me every time, like how much I'm doing and how connected I am with different academic institutions. But I've been blessed to be able to traffic in a space where there's so much resonance between where I land philosophically, theologically, and these institutions. And like things constantly change.
Yeah.
right? Things constantly change. And will there be, in 20 years, Christian institutions that, right, close because the feds put more pressure on defining Title IX and hiring practices? And so for right now, I've had to choose to surrender some things and not pursue things, not pursue publishing with certain publishers, not pursue working with certain universities, not participating in certain organizations, because of the expectation of compromise, because of, right, this abdication of truth that you're talking about in this kind of post-truth environment.
Hey everybody, I want to slide right in and interrupt the conversation. I want to ask you to do us a huge favor. If you can go to wherever you get your podcast and review it. Give us a review and give us, bam, 5 stars. It would be such a help to promote our show in Apple and in other places. Also, if you could like it and share it, if you watch it on YouTube, if you will comment about the joy or the thrill or the insights that you're gaining from it, I want you to know that every comment becomes a catalyst for somebody else. Again, it would be a huge favor to us if you'd do that for us. But now let's go right back into the conversation. It's interesting, even you're a psychologist, and you know my affection to you and my affection to the expertise that you carry, and even the whole fraternity of psychologists. I have a huge admiration. Therapists as a whole, I have a huge admiration. But what can begin to happen is that people will assume that if one psychologist says something, every other psychologist agrees with them. And they call it science. And so you'll have somebody who will say, well, so-and-so's a sociopath. And then you'll have, in private conversation, somebody else say, no, they're not. No, they're not. And I find it interesting how much that is happening within this, elite group of thinkers, if you will. And so could you speak to that? And really what I'm driving at is for a parent to know that just because one expert says that they have, even in neuroscience, because neuroscience isn't just about neuroscience, so much of it is the spin or the interpretation of what that means. And as Dr. Bill Struthers said in the interview I had with him, that there is a lot of overreach in that interpretation that is not fair. It's not real, it's not true.
And unless you know that, you're subjected to whatever the interpretation of that individual author is.
Yes.
So you queued up in my mind, it's been a number of years ago now, but the Royal Academy of Psychiatry, kind of the global prestigious institution for psychiatry, actually amended their stance on human sexuality to say, instead of a genetic, like homosexuality in particular, that rather than being a genetic phenomenon, it's a phenomenon that includes biological and environmental factors. For where we were through the early 2000s, to say like, this is genetic.
Yeah.
And then to say, wow, here we are years later, amending our stance because we've mapped the human genome. We have no here's the evidence. For them, credit to them at the Royal Academy for modifying their stance, but it happens very quietly.
Yeah.
That wasn't front page news. Right?
And
here's our best working model. Our best working model went from genetic to biological, and we could spend probably the rest of our time talking about the difference between genetic and biological. Biological meaning so much of our biology, neurobiology, is impacted by environmental experience.
There you go.
Right? Versus genetic, which is largely driving some biological expression. So it's fascinating when a shift like that is made, but in our sexual narrative, what parents have to understand is there is a very unidirectional pressure. Like, even when science confirms something, you know what, we got that wrong for a while, let's go back, there's no going back.
Yeah.
There's no going back. And I think we see that with things that have been absorbed as somewhat normative that used to be, years and years and years ago, considered very deviant behavior.
Yeah.
I'm not even talking about homosexuality here, just in the larger practice of human sexuality.
Yeah.
Things that used to be considered incredibly deviant are now much more normative and integrated into our sexual imaginations. Well, it's because of that push.
Yeah.
And the harder we're pushing in one direction, defining things, the more frequent things that used to be, abnormal or unhealthy even, become healthy because they're normative, not because they're actually healthy. Nothing's changed about that dimension.
Well,
but they're normative, and that's the standard we use, which doubles us back to if parents are borrowing their cues for how to raise sexually healthy kids from culture, culture's pushing hard one direction, calling things that 20, 30, 40 years ago, we would have blushed and walked out of the room at the sound of, the hearing those things. Right now populates conversations on the radio, at the water cooler, on television, in the movies. Right? Like if we're borrowing our cues from that environment is perpetually absorbing things as this unidirectional push into the fringes continues.
So as a professional, as a psychologist, not a theologian, as a psychologist, why does that even matter? Why can't we just say, everybody can do what they want to do. Everybody can have a biology that is evolved through environments and wounds and you name it. Right. Why can't we just let everybody do what they want to do and support them? I'm talking from a psychological, because what you just framed up was all psychological and what we can do to, identify. Why do we need to name it? Why do we need to identify it? Why do we need to differentiate that which seems to be healthy and that which seems to not be healthy?
I've worked in higher education long enough, Patrick, and maybe this applies in the church as well, developed this theory I call niches of power. Like anytime somebody, and maybe this is true at hospitals and every work environment, I don't know, my context is higher education. Yeah. Anytime one office comes into power, and sometimes it's one person, secretarial, administrative, professional, faculty, it doesn't matter. Like as soon as there is power absorbed, like that person doesn't share the power. Even at Christian institutions, right? Like I'm not gonna, like, oh, it's the way of the world. Like at Christian institutions, like that's where this theory got formed. And I'm sure it holds true at churches too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I see the very little difference between Christian higher education and how the church is structured and operates. But I think if we pan out of that, right, like that this niches of power theory says as soon as somebody has power, like in that system, they're gonna do everything they can to retain it and grow it.
Yeah.
So if we pan out of that and look at different fields, right? Psychology, sociology, early adopters to addressing issues of human sexuality. And you can't just have your power. Yeah. Right? Like it's Machiavellian here. Like you have to grow your power. Like that's survival. Survival is not maintaining your power, it's growing your power.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of where we're at. We have to expand into new territory. If we're going to stay professionally relevant as a field, we have to be discovering new things. Yeah. And sometimes we just create new things to discover. Right. And that's part of the reality, right? Like that's part of the driver, I think, even in the field of psychology. As much as we're trying to understand the human psyche, sometimes I think we make things up and kind of populate our discoveries with what we want to be true. Yeah. What we want to find is projected into the science that we're doing in the field of psychology.
And to me, it also seems at a very simplistic level like a lack of empathy and a lack of compassion, because if somebody is pursuing something and calling it normalized, it's normative, and yet in reality it's not, then we are creating suffering and calling that suffering normative. And that's hurtful.
Can I give you a case in point?
Yeah.
So I was at a training recently with someone that you and I both know and hold in high esteem. Yeah. Her work is impeccable. Yeah. And her comment to those of us in this training was, you can no longer use the phrase same-sex attracted and work in this context and have this professional affiliation. And I thought, this is intriguing. Like because I've got plenty of patients and clients who say like, yo, this thing doesn't fit for me. Like, here's my arousal template. It doesn't fit for me. Yeah. Right? Like I feel distress about the nature of my same-sex attraction. It's ego dystonic, right? Like it's incongruent with our understanding of ourselves. Yeah. And they come to me looking for assistance with, how do I walk out this story? Yeah. What are the wounds? What are the drivers? What are the pains? What are the experiences that shaped this? Yeah. And then to hear a global leader in our field say, well, we can't use this anymore because somebody misappropriated it. Somebody caused harm by saying this. And now we just want to, let's cancel culture, right? If I can use a more colloquial phrase, like we're just going to cancel this thing because one person misused it. Yeah. I'm thinking like, time out, right? Like what am I supposed to, like back to suffering and empathy, right? Like, am I just supposed to start pushing a narrative on my clients? Like, well, actually, that isn't real. Your distress is all made up. Like, if you would only go against your understanding of yourself and your understanding of your desires.
Yes.
Right? You're telling me you don't desire this. It causes strain. It causes distress. It causes intrapsychic tension.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, what am I supposed to do when that construct is canceled? Their distress is still very real.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And my empathy is saying, like, I'm going to keep calling it what I've been calling it.
Yeah.
Because that's their language. That's not my language. I'm not imposing my language on patients. I'm honoring their experience of themselves and trying to help them explore and experience and express. Okay, what is this? Let's together journey into this.
Let me jump in again and tell you about two amazing opportunities for pastors, spouses, and senior leaders of ministry. We have a monthly, we do on Zoom. It's a 2-hour event every second Monday of the month throughout 2021. We also have 6-week modules that are called weeklies. So we have a monthly, and we also have an opportunity for weeklies. The weeklies, we help you rediscover the deeper parts of your story. First, I want to dig down into our monthlies. We gather with Dr. Todd Bowman, who's a psychologist, neurobiologist, is on many of our podcasts. And then we have usually a guest who is a tenured minister, a strategist. And we, for 2 hours, will have 20 to 30 plus different people who are gathered together. We collaborate and you set the topic. We come out of the gate with a particular thing on our hearts, and then you want to talk about tactics, strategies, what to do in a political season or in a pandemic season, or what needs to happen in your marriage or your parenting. Maybe there is a parishioner that is just triggering you like crazy, or it's so complex you're trying to figure it out. Well, we've gathered together the best hearts, the best minds to be able to pull that stuff apart and then help you put it together again. So that is our monthlies. Again, it's free, doesn't cost you a dime. It's our gift to you. Then we have our weeklies. Our weeklies are with 6 as a minimum, up to 10. We have males and females that are set apart, and we help you understand the emotional drivers that have been driving you and what has actually inked your sense of identity. It's a profound experience. Our graduates tell of how life-changing it has been for them. We walk through your history and we help you make sense of your present. We believe that God wants to expose roots that are actually behind our behaviors. It's an amazing discovery time to really rediscover you. We help you redeem life, and we help you re-dream ministry. We would love for you to be a part of it. Normally, I get $150 for coaching, $150 an hour. This whole program for 6 weeks in Mod 1 would be valued at around $900 of work. And yet, it is my gift to you. I would be honored to walk the journey and to go heart and heart and hand in hand with you. Both the monthlies and the weeklies are featured on Zoom, so wherever you are in the world, it actually is something you can do. Invite your pastor and ministry friends to jump on with you, and let's have a revival. All you have to do is go to redInkrevival.com for either the monthly or the weekly. Red Ink, REDINK, revival.com. Be sure to register, and I can't wait to see you at both. So you're clearly not projecting judgment on anybody about their journeys. And yet, if we as Christians, so I'm flipping now back to theology, if we as Christians believe that sin is God's definition of that which would create dysfunction or it would be unhealthy, it would lead us down a path that we would have emotional dysregulation, it would cause us to live disintegrated, then we have a clear line on what is going to be necessarily normative and that which would not be normative, right? So that's I think as a Christian, we got to come back to that. I will say to our audience that I taught an entire message on things related to primarily LGBTQ issues. and wanted to come at it from a very empathetic, compassionate perspective.
Absolutely.
And yet be honest with the text. So I did it in a very closed environment within my church, and then I allowed people to come to a URL, and it's available to anybody who wants to go there. You just have to sign off to not exploit it, and I give 3 different check boxes to help you know what I mean by that. And it's just an honest conversation. And I don't want to be canceled, so that is our process. But if people will go to point with an E, pointe.info/FAQ, frequently asked questions, FAQ-2, they can get the URL at YouTube to be able to watch the message and get a theological groundwork around that. So once a parent is working through these kind of issues, and we could spend so much time on something like lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, we could spend a lot of time around that, but I just want to kind of hit it in the idea that our kids are having exposure, that this is a completely normalized thing. It's something that not only should be acceptable to all of us in compassion and empathy, but now it might be that if you see somebody of the same sex that you are attracted, that there is an attraction of some level, that if you see that, it may mean that you're gay. And I just want to clarify with you to help parents that even among the secular professionals in this field, that having an attraction that's just, that person's really funny, they got tremendous charisma, the way they look does create a chemistry reaction in me, but that in no way, even in a secular orientation framework, does not mean that they are gay. And this is incredibly important and never talked about.
It's such a tragedy. And what I hear in that is, I've used the word sexualization a lot. What I hear in that, Patrick, is that there's such a reduction of the human person to exclusively the sexual, that as soon as there's any type of phileo experience of love, right? Sometimes we just want to be close to people.
Yeah.
Right? Like physical affection. Go to a freshman dormitory in college, right? Like there's immense amounts of affection and physical touch, and it's incredibly healthy. And I'm afraid that some of that is dissipating because there's, like now all of a sudden homoerotic nuance in spaces that in some cultures are still completely normative, but for us in a kind of hyper-sexualized, pornified imagination, right? For our kids, and maybe it's not even our kids, right? What certain institutions and certain influences in our culture are trying to do is to say, if you have this thing, it exclusively means this. And there's no other space to make sense of what that attraction might be. And there's, I don't know, probably get some negative feedback around this. I don't really care. That's violent. That's aggressive. That's abusive. To say, you have this one thing, therefore it means this exclusively. And then to start poisoning or populating someone's mind with a narrative,
which does happen.
That's abusive. Like if that was context we talked about in our last episode, like that could be grooming.
Yes.
For abuse, like it's the exact same process when we don't allow that child the opportunity to have a host of ways of making sense. How much of this is social attraction, wanting to be affiliated with someone? How much of it is, wow, like you're a lot like my dad, and right, like you're familiar to me, and like I love my dad. I want to be close to my dad. You remind me, like I want friendship. Maybe there is a sexual thing there. Right, like let's explore that without going to this distance of reducing the fullness of personhood for a child. We could get into the research on same-sex attraction and how it spontaneously remits. Oftentimes later in life. Lisa Diamond, a lesbian researcher out in Utah, did her doctoral work at Cornell University. Right, as a lesbian woman in the secular context, right, has all sorts of rich literature that suggests like we're doing injustice to folks who are identifying when they're young as LGBTQ because they're not even through puberty. Their biological narrative is still at play. It's still saying something.
Yes. And if that child in those ages begins to experiment, it will build within their neurobiology neural pathways of dopamine receptors experiencing a high. And when they do, it then, for what you and I as a sexual addiction professional would talk about, it develops their arousal template, or how they have certain images, certain behaviors, certain things that heighten their sense of intensity. And so if a child is inappropriately groomed in those ages, later in their life, they will have heightened levels of arousal towards same sex that is not about any kind of orientation. It is 100% about how they developed it because of those who groomed them.
Yeah, and for any parent that's in this process of with their kids walking out a story, I mean, we could do a whole podcast series and get parents on to talk about what is the process like, what would they wish other parents had shared with them, or they wish they'd known about navigating this process of a child identifying or coming out as gay. Mark Yarhouse at Regent University has done a fantastic job. He's got a litany of research and published texts, and hopefully not shortcutting conversation, but to really direct folks if this is a space, a conversation that's really hitting home for folks. I mean, that in my mind is the first place to start, is to start looking at Mark Yarhouse and some of his work to figure out how can I walk this out?
Yes.
What is attraction versus orientation versus identity?
Huge.
But something you said a little bit ago, not just, I want to kind of pan out a little bit, because there's so much more. And even our conversation here a little bit maybe is mimicking what we see culturally, where this LGBTQ plus conversation really dominates the conversation when there's so much more that we have to be addressing. So not to pivot prematurely, but something you said a little bit ago about kind of all these terms and definitions and the changing, what is pansexuality, and like morally is like, if pan is everything and everyone, like, does that mean you're a pedophile as well? Because if pan means everything, you're okay with right?
Yeah.
Like, and I just think it's not thought through. I don't think that's what pansexuality means.
Right.
But I think it's not thought through because we're in this post-truth environment. It's all about feeling, not about rational cognitive processing. Yeah. But there's so much more to what our kids are even experiencing construct-wise, things that we never know about. There's a British study mid this past decade, 2014, 2015, I think is when it was published. These British sociologists went into a 5th grade classroom to see kind of what scatological terms might children be aware of, just to get their finger on the pulse of how sexualized are 5th graders in Britain. Patrick, the researchers had to go back and ask these 5th graders to explain some of the language they were using, because their language was already evolving and they're creating. I've got a 5th grader.
Yeah.
He's 11 years old.
Yeah.
He carries a stuffy around the house sometimes. He can't tie his shoes some days. He forgets his mask all the time.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he's a child.
Yes.
At 11 years old.
Yes, sure, absolutely.
I can't fathom, as a CSAT, as a psychologist, as a neurobiologist, sexologist, whatever labels I might carry, I can't imagine him having enough exposure to human sexuality to start creating a novel language with his peers around what they've experienced.
It's so wild.
It's truly unfathomable. Like, I don't say that to be, sensationalistic. Like, I literally cannot compute how much time and exposure and trafficking that you have to have that's publicly known for, as a cohort, a group, a generational experience, to be constructing new language around human biology, scatological terminology, et cetera.
Yeah.
That's dark and heavy. I mean, I feel the weight of that spiritually and emotionally. What most parents don't know is, historically, there's been about a 10-year lag between what we see in British literature and what shows up here in the States.
Really?
And that gap continues to close.
Yeah.
That gap continues to close. As sexualized of a culture as we are in the U.S., really Western Europe and other places, Asia comes to mind, are really drivers of the trends. Right. So types of pornography. We haven't even talked about sex robots, and in 5 years, you're going to have to be talking about sex robots.
Yeah.
Right. Most people don't know that in Spain, there's a company that produces pediatric sex robots.
Oh my gosh.
Right. So like you can literally order a robot that looks like a child that serves a sexual function, and that gets celebrated. Right. Like there's this unidirectional push.
Yes, it is. And
right, but like we're not thinking about the neurobiology of like how long is it going to take of acting out with your robot before like that is unsatisfying. Like it doesn't.
Yeah.
If the drive is insatiable, the need for novelty is truly insatiable. Like how long before that
it hits,
spills over, right? So like it's just interesting, and maybe that's like the burden I carry is knowing all these random things that most parents they never want to think about them and they don't want to hear about them.
Well, I think about parents who might have a child that is, and it would be a gift if a child ever came to a parent and shared some of what they were mentally in their imagination thinking around an LGBTQ plus internal experience. So they're processing this stuff. If they told a parent, I think I would tell that parent, if the parent asked me, what do I need to do with that? I think you're going to need help. Absolutely. You're going to need an expert to walk this out with. This is my pastoral dad and being a professional in the space, this is how I would do it. I'd love to hear what you think about how I would do it. I would say and I would tell the criteria of going to what the certifications are for a therapist or psychologist. And then I would say in the initial interview, and I would say look for a Christian. Normally, I wouldn't say that about every issue if you're dealing with anxiety or depression, but this issue, I would narrow it down. I would say go to a Christian, and then I would say you need to ask this person if at the end of it, do you personally believe that this is a sin? And the reason I would is because there can be massive help in exploration once you have the security to know where that gap gets closed. So I would do that. Now, as a psychologist, how do you make sense of that?
I would do it on the front end.
At the very first.
I wouldn't schedule a session. I'd get on the phone. I get phone calls all the time.
Just an interview. It's an orientation.
Absolutely. Yeah. As a sex addiction specialist, do you understand trauma-informed models? Do you understand attachment theory? Do you understand betrayal trauma?
Yeah.
Like, well, absolutely, right? Like, did you not see CSAT at the end of but like, most people don't know what that means.
Right.
But it's like, yes, like I've spent the time and the years and the supervision, becoming a CSAT, like having this gold standard. So same thing, right? Like the ability to ask hard questions on the front end.
Yes.
And vet the people that you trust your story to. I don't care if it's your kid's story or your story or anything pertaining to human sexuality.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's okay to ask hard questions on the front end because A, it saves some money and some time.
Yes.
But B, it lets you stay rooted in your beliefs, your desires, your values, and make sure there's a goodness of fit from go instead of feeling like you have to shop around and spend a bunch of money and a bunch of sessions.
I think it's huge. How would you like to reboot your personal finances this year? How would you like to take control of your money, turning small wins into big results? I want to encourage you to check out my wife Tina's financial coaching business at tinanorris.org. You might be wondering, what is a financial coach? A coach is someone who will personally team up with you to outline financial goals, inspire you with energy, help you stay focused on your goals, and so much more. You can do it all through Zoom, and she provides a free initial consultation, so there's no pain or cost to you for your first steps. Maybe you've been to several Financial Peace University cycles, left with great intentions, but struggled to execute. You need a trainer, a coach, another human that won't shame or judge you to help you stay on track. Tina is a certified expert that will help you with clarifying financial dreams, understanding spending patterns, reviewing all financial obligations, assessing financial and insurance needs, defining a spending plan, understanding your emotional profile related to money, building margin for savings and emergency funds, learning strategies for attacking debt, and referring recommended financial advisors to multiply your tomorrow. and she isn't selling any products, policies, or investments. She is the ultimate financial teammate. As Tina's husband of 30 years, I can tell you firsthand how much of a difference Tina's skills and giftings have made. Our financial portfolio wouldn't be a fraction of what it is today if it wasn't for her. She works with clients that are single parents, everyday people, pastors and church staff, as well as high-income professionals. I've known executives of Fortune 500 companies that manage billion-dollar budgets at work, but then come home to complete financial disorder and disappointments. Shame roars at them as they face the stresses of marriage, kids, and struggling retirement plans. A personal trainer can change the way you think, emote, and behave. If you have friends, church members, clients, or even young marrieds that are launching their financial lives, you will do them all a favor to have them check out this amazing option. If professional athletes need a coach to win the day to fulfill their dreams, then you and I do too. And you won't find anybody better to help you get there than Tina Norris. Set up your free consultation from anywhere in the world today. Go to tinanorris.org to find out all the details. And we both know that there are a lot of Christians, and I'm not hurling anger or insult at anybody, but we know that there are a bunch of Christian therapists who would not be able to say they believe that ultimately is biblically a sin.
There's probably listeners that are going to disagree
with
where you and I fall, but I think the same thing holds true.
Yeah.
Like, get on the phone and say, like, who is it that can blend their understanding of theology and sexuality and human development and helping my child?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that that's critical. If somebody's struggling, to help them, walk with them. This isn't, and you don't want to make even going to a psychologist or a therapist. This is so huge, and there's so many people that have knee-jerk reactions to going to a therapist. I must be really screwed up if I've got to go to a therapist. And my response is, if Tiger Woods needs a golf coach, if LeBron James has had people work with him, if Stephen Curry has a shooting coach, are you kidding me? That all off season he's working on all of his drills for that.
But it's okay for us. We've got it, right? Like, we've got it.
Yeah. So I think it's important that when we talk to our kids about this, we're like, hey man, I want you to meet your best. And let me just say this, as a parent, it would really help your kids if you got in therapy yourself so that you could model how important growing is. I go to therapist, you go to therapist, and we're, certified in a lot of areas. So anyway, I think that that's incredibly important. So I do want to remind everybody the point.info/FAQ-2 if they want to take part in a message. It was a full A to Z understanding of these issues from a biblical context. And so let's move on, because we've got a lot yet to hit.
I want to kind of move into masturbation, because we hit that in the last episode and opened it a little bit, but didn't get into the fullness of it.
Yes.
But as we kind of pivot to that, I also want to pan out just for a second and say, the importance of integration, of kind of living congruently, of what we say, what we feel, what we believe, all being anchored in a sense of truth for us theologically in Scripture, is so important. Because as we've been talking, kind of that list we started with, that conflictual space where there's messages that are different than practices.
Yeah. Yes.
It makes me wonder. I've worked with enough folks who are, bi or lesbian or gay or same-sex attracted, even transgender folks. And there's an immense amount of intrapsychic conflict in those spaces, and it makes me wonder, what were the norms? What were the mores? What were the practices? What were the incongruences in the family system?
Yeah.
And how does that exacerbate any of that intrapsychic conflict, any of that dissonance between I believe one thing, but I feel another thing.
Yeah.
And how does that over time, maybe that the conflict there create crevices for struggle to fall into and take root and grow?
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
Yeah. Well, let's dig down, man.
Yeah. Masturbation is a common question as I'm out traveling and speaking. I'm of two minds about it, in all honesty.
Yeah.
Because I think there's two camps.
Yeah.
One would be a bit more permissive, a bit more like this is healthy function. God designed your body this way. Others would be like, this is a part of something that's intended to be experienced and expressed relationally. Your body's going to naturally process, as a male at least, process excess semen or seminal fluid out because of its toxic nature to the body, right? Nocturnal emissions or wet dreams or whatever language we want to use there. All right, so God designed a release valve, so you don't really need to do it. You know, and that's probably too restrictive. There's probably a continuum with folks, and they fall somewhere on that line. With the one group, kind of the one end of the continuum, I would say that if that's where you land in your parenting process, I think it's really important to be stewarding our kids' sexuality. Kind of come back to that phrase.
So just to be clear, if you land on masturbation.
Yeah, if your frame of reference is it's not sinful, it's how God designed their body, right? Okay, like land there. But you can't land there with passivity. Mark Glazer would say like fantasy, masturbation, porn, absolutely the building blocks of addiction. So if you're going to be permissive around one of these building blocks of addiction, I hope that you're putting some guardrails up to make sure that addiction doesn't take root.
Yeah.
Right? I've talked to a lot of 15-year-old kids about their sexuality. The idea of masturbating without fantasy is nonsense to them.
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about? Like, can you do it without like fostering an imagination of the girl from school or what you saw on the computer or the television?
Yeah.
That's a thing? Like, that can actually happen? Yeah. Right? Like, so it's just interesting, right? Like that we have this culture of digital natives, right? Like whose imaginations are just replete with sexual stimuli because we live in a sexualized culture, that it's almost impossible to separate those two. So now we've got, in this group, so parents need to know this, right? If you're kind of taking a hands-off, no pun intended, approach to masturbation, right, then you have to be asking hard questions.
Yes.
I call it the 5 Fs of masturbation. The first is doing formation with your kids around frequency, right? Like most young men, post-pubescent young men, are going to have nocturnal emissions. You know, one most commonly, average is probably 1.5, 1.6, all the way up. Some people 4, you know, once a week, depending on their body and where they're at in development, times a month. Right. So saying, like, if the frequency is 1.5 times a month on average for a man's body to naturally process excess semen fluid, all right, then the frequency should be no more than whatever your body would naturally do. Right? And if you can't sustain that, like, that's a problem.
Interesting.
Right. Second F is so no, or the thinking about frequency and managing frequency. The second is fantasy, right? Like absolutely no fantasy.
Yeah.
Right, because then we're starting to again queue up, right? Experiences, neurobiology 101, neurons that fire together wire together. So now we're really kind of configuring the arousal template.
Yeah.
Right, who am I thinking about? Did I get permission from that person to think about them when I was masturbating?
Yeah.
To her image, his image? Right? So.
Yeah.
And again, right, like we maybe even yesterday with porn, we didn't talk enough about the fact that this isn't, it's so easy for us to assume when we're both men, that when we're talking about sexuality, we're doing it from an exclusively male perspective.
Right.
And I'm sitting here thinking, like, you know what? The fastest growing demographic of porn users in American society is 17 to 30-year-old young women.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like parents, this is not just something to talk with your sons about.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's just not.
Absolutely.
Right. So when I'm talking about these, like I'm talking about seminal fluid and nocturnal emissions, but like I think the same thing holds true in our conversation with young ladies.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
Right? Obviously the piping is different and the mechanics are different, but the construct of frequency like needs to be universal.
Yeah.
Same thing with fantasy.
Yeah.
Right. Not creating again, fire together, wire together. Basically, our neural networks are developed around intensity, right? John Money, 1981, says his study showed that orgasm is the brain's most powerful endogenous or natural neurochemical experience.
Oh, man.
Right? It's a $100 bill. It's intense. So you've automatically got one of these criteria. And then historicity, like how long have you been doing that behavior, not masturbation, but anything. Right? If you want to get better at golf, you go to the driving range.
Yeah.
Right? Historicity, frequency of reinforcement. So how long has it been happening? Frequency, right? How frequently is it used? How long has that neural network existed, and how intensely is it reinforced?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so that's kind of the what undergirds what I'm talking about here with why frequency is so important, why fantasy, we're trying to keep our brains from tucking away memories that can be later used for what we call euphoric recall.
Euphoric recall. Yeah.
Like kind of in our minds going back to something. So fantasy, important to manage, right? That just fantasy, I would say, like, if you can't do without fantasizing, like,
Yeah.
right, like now, again, building block behaviors for addiction, fantasy, and masturbation.
Yeah.
So frequency, fantasy. The third is function. Third F in the 5 Fs is function. What's the function of the behavior? And really what I'm talking about there is no mood altering. Oh, I can't get to sleep, I need to masturbate. I'm having a really hard day, I need to masturbate. Right? Because then what we're doing neurologically is saying anytime I feel distress, anytime I feel boredom, anytime I feel I can't go to sleep,
Wow.
I use this powerful endogenous neurochemical. Judith Grissel wrote a book called Never Enough. Right? It's about the neurobiology of different substances. She's a former drug addict, tells her kind of personal story as she writes. It's one of the most fascinating books I've ever read.
Wow.
Quite frankly. She talks about opponent process theory. So basically it's not the chemical that is making us addicted. It's that the chemical neurologically is reinforcing what happened right before we injected, or inhaled it. Or in this instance, right before we manually stimulated the experience.
Yeah.
Right, so like we're gonna be more distressed, so our brains want the fix.
Yeah.
Even with sexual stuff, right? Like, so why is it so important to not use the function of mood altering behavior?
Interesting.
Again, like now we're talking about the neurobiology of addiction and onboarding, kind of literally experience dependent wise crafting, not just addiction in a sexual realm, but like the potential for onboarding other addictions down the road.
Yeah.
Paired with whatever it is that we're trying to escape, anxiety, boredom, distress, can't sleep, etc. Right? And it gets back to like if the function is exclusively biological, right? Like young men will report, old men will report, like if they haven't had, release, that their testicles begin to hurt.
Yeah.
Right? There's a strain of tension there. Why? Because semen's toxic to our bodies and it's trying to get rid of it. Right? Which is why nocturnal emissions exist and they're a thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like then if the function is really truly biological and it's not about the function of reducing mood or fantasizing about someone, right? Like there can be a biological function to it, right? If you're going to be in this camp that says like masturbation is okay, like that needs to be clearly communicated and outlined.
Yeah.
And everyone's at this point in listening to us like, there's no way, Todd, I'm ever going to talk to my kids like this. Right? Like then you might need to think about like sending a different message around masturbation. If you're unwilling to go to this length to have the kind of directness and conversation that I'm having with you, with your kid, you need to navigate a different frame of what you believe is appropriate or not. Because you can't create this space like, it's fine, they're going to do it anyway. And like, it's not 1974 anymore, Patrick.
Right.
It's just not.
Yeah.
And the norms have changed, and the rules have changed, and what our kids are dealing with has changed.
Yes.
Right. So and we talked about this the other day. Their neurobiology is already so much more queued up for addiction than yours or I ever was or probably will be.
Yeah.
Right. So if we're unwilling to do the hard work of parenting, then we need to maybe down-regulate or downgrade what we think is acceptable or permissive.
Yeah.
So frequency, critical. No fantasy, important. Functionality being more biological than mood regulating. The last two are fidelity and faithfulness, the last two Fs, right? Having a space of accountability, right? And if you're unwilling to be true and honest with someone and openly process what your sexual story is, therapy is a great place to do that. Most of the people that I work with check in something with me about their sexual experience. They don't want to go tell their mom, they don't want to go tell their pastor, right? But there needs to be somebody walking that story out. In faithfulness, what is the ongoing spiritual formation that is happening in this case, that young man or young woman's life? And we're not just talking about the biology, but we're trying to give them social connection and spiritual direction and really address the wholeness of who they are as persons and not keeping their sexual experience so disconnected. Right? So fidelity, the willingness to be honest with someone, and accountability, but also faithfulness, the willingness to participate in a space where spiritual formation is happening.
Hey, I want to invite you, if you are listening and thinking, I have so many questions I would like to ask, we would love to address your questions on an upcoming episode. In fact, we may do an entire episode on the one question that you have. If you will simply email us at redinkrevival@gmail.com, we will catalog all of these questions, and we would love to be able to address the things on your heart and on your mind. So be sure to get in touch with us, and we'll take the journey together. I think it's so amazing how you have created these 5 F's and you've put together guidelines like that. I do want to say, as a parent, when you have the 5 F's, it's not healthy to just say don't, to just say stop, to just make it a rule, to fix it. This isn't about behaviorism. If a child is involved in any one of those 5, and then multiple of those 5, what you do is you walk them through an exploration of why. Yeah. Why do you think that you have violated one of the 5? Why? What is it that's so important to you? Let's dig into that.
What happens beforehand? What are you feeling? Is there more going on that we don't know about, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're violating one of these and you're altering your mood, or you can't sleep, like, is there underlying anxiety going on here? Are you depressed? Is there bullying going on? I mean, it can be the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, to me, that's powerful. And I also want to say to parents that if you as a dad or a mom are harsh in your attitude towards any sexual behavior that is outside of your family, you watch somebody on TV and they do something that is in violation of your own ethic or your values, and you're harsh to them, it is impossible for your kid not to absorb part of that harshness towards them if they were to ever have anything. So I want to ask parents to consider going into your own story and find out why it is that you need to be so harsh about anybody else's sexuality. And that doesn't mean that you're abdicating. It doesn't mean that you're compromising your values. What it means is, why do you feel the need to have a one-up power position to crush somebody else in what their sexuality is? Again, the environment or culture we create in our homes around exploration and kindness and empathy and interest as what is this? Where is it coming from? Why is it happening with a desire to be known, to see them, to feel them? To me, that stuff is foundational and critical. I love the 5 F's that you just described. And again, some parents are not going to be able to actually articulate the way that you just did. And that's okay. But such as you have, that's what you give. And come back to this, listen to it over and over. And then,
or they're in the book, right? Like they're in Angry Birds.
Yeah.
I was shocked, right? I was shocked that that actually made it in, because there's content that absolutely got cut. But that content made it in. I was like, okie dokie.
There it is. Well, I have to be honest, or I want to be honest and transparent, that is exactly how I parented my boys. I was very involved. I asked questions about all kinds of things. I would ask questions, and I tried to make it age appropriate. And as a dad, you don't get everything right. I didn't want my boys to be weird in terms of religious weird. So, I did talk about various things at various times. Sometimes I probably laughed about something further than what I should have because, it could move into more of that saturated environment. But overall, I just wanted to make sure I was tuned in because I felt like I was not tuned into. I wanted to make sure that I knew what was going on with my kids, and I knew that there is a hyper-sexuality going on in our culture. And what you just said, I want to further embolden this idea that our kids are in a sexualized environment that we were never a part of, that actually is a predictor of a higher percentage of addictions in our culture. What I want to say to a parent, you may think, yeah, I just don't know that I want to get into that mess. I don't know that I want to fully invest in that. I just want you to know your grandkids are going to be in a multiplied worse environment than your kids are. If you don't teach your kids now and go through the awkward tunnel of chaos to be able to share with them what you do know and how to walk it out, you're actually creating another cycle of negligence down into your grandkids. And so why not gift your kids and your grandkids, leave a legacy that I don't know everything, but I know something. And I'm going to love my kids through it.
And you don't have to do it perfectly. You certainly don't and can't do it alone. You don't have to do it alone, and we can't do it alone. But yeah, probably if I can give hope.
Yes.
One of the most powerful things I've ever done, working with a teenager and their parents, right? Because I'm sure there's people that are like, my oldest kids are grown. I've got a 14-year-old at home, right? He hates me or she is disinterested in anything from me. One of the most powerful things I've ever done with teens and parents is Amnesty Day, right? Like, let's sit down and you just lay out what your life looks like, right? And there's no punishment. It's amnesty, right? Like, it's grace day.
Yeah.
There might be right boundaries that need to be set, like you're smoking weed at your friend's house every time you're there. There's a boundary, but like, there's not punishment. You're not grounded. You're not, right? Like, they can come over here. You guys can hang out in the living room, like, but you're not. Right? Whatever the stipulations need to be, from a protective boundary dynamic, which is different than punitive.
Yeah.
As a way to kind of get that finger on the pulse of what a student's life really looks like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to say, what is it, right? Like, tell me what you know. What have you experienced? What have you seen? What are your struggles?
Yeah.
Right? Like, let me start now.
Yeah.
Right? With my own story, my own expertise, that we all carry in our life, right? We don't think we're experts, right? Like, you're an expert in your kid.
Yeah.
You've raised them their entire life.
Yeah.
Right? Or your blended family, right? Like, I've only known them since they were 7. Like, well, you've known them since they were 7. Like, you've known them for 7 years or 9 years or whatever. Right? Like, that we have to give ourselves some credit and say, like, okay, we've got some intuitions. We've got feelings around things. We've got curiosities, but we didn't know how to ask.
Yeah.
And at some point, I think there is a point of no return that we perceive. I don't think it's true. Right? Well, they're 9 and now, or they're 11 and they're starting puberty and I missed my chance. So they're gonna get it in 4th grade at school and then 5th grade again and then 7th grade. Like, I'll just trust that. But they need you as your mom or their mom. They need you as their dad.
Yes.
To speak into that. And most of the kids that I work with are desirous of a parent to care enough to crack that conversation open and just say, like, teach me.
Yeah.
Like, what do you know? What have you seen? What have you struggled with? Like, I know the stats. Go read Angry Birds and Killer Bees. You'll have some of the stats.
Yeah.
A little bit outdated now because it's 5 or 6 years ago. Right? Like, but you'll have some of the stats like, wow, like, I wonder if you've seen bondage pornography online.
Yeah.
Right? You're a 17-year-old boy, 43% chance. Okay, like, bestiality, right? Like, stuff that, it's Amnesty Day, right? Like, they're gonna be like, oh, Dad, like, this is so gross. Like, you know what? Like, I'm sorry that I didn't ask different questions and intervene in your life when you were younger.
Yeah.
Right? But like, now I am having to ask some hard questions.
Yeah.
Right? Because I just want to help. I want to know what you know and how I can help.
Yeah, yeah. Let me break in one more time and tell you about redinkrevival.com, REDINK revival.com, and sign up for our blog e-newsletter. Every month it'll hit your inbox, and in it we'll have not only a provocative blog post by me and some of our other professionals, but also we will share with you our events, our monthlies, our weeklies, all the details are there. And I want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast. It's such a help to us. Review it, comment, like, the whole deal. If you share it to your friends when something lands for you, who knows how that could multiply our influence. And it'd be a gift to us, and it'd be a gift to all your friends. I just want you to know I'm holding you in my heart. We're praying for you. We believe that 2021 is a year of supernatural increase. Some parents are going to be freaked out because they feel like,
That's why they come to my office and pay me to do that.
Yes, and all of these different things you just talked about are even broader than this idea. Some parents are like, well, what if they ask me what I do to their mama, or what their mama does to me? What kind of sexual behaviors? And I just want to say that actually happened as I'm going through it with my boys, and when they do, I say
very
to
common.
them,
and maybe that's why we avoid the conversations, because we don't want to have to talk about that intimately.
Well, but what I would tell my boys is I would say, hey guys, I'll talk to you about anything you want, but when it comes to what Mom and I personally do together, I hold that in sacred honor between her and I. So I'll laugh at the question and I'll appreciate the fact you ask, but I'll say, let's talk about general populations and protect that. I think it's, again, there's so many aspects to this that I wish that we had unlimited time to dig down on. But let's just quickly talk about birth control for teenagers. Yeah. How would you help a parent who may have a sexually active teenager? Giving birth control, does that put a stamp of approval on it and say, just go have sex? Or how would you, as a Christian, as somebody who cares about the ethic, talk to us about it real quick?
Yeah. Real quick, that's a challenge. My quick response to that, Patrick, is going to be, this is a really big topic.
Yes.
And there's so much more to like hormonal contraception than just the am I not getting pregnant dynamic. Sometimes it's given as a prescription for a variety of kind of medical maladies or experiences that young ladies might be having. When it comes to the reproductive side, though, I'll just try and keep it people need to do the research. If you're going to make that decision for your child, you better go do a lot of research.
Yeah.
Because even though it's really common, and back to this normative thing, there's a flip side to that coin.
Yeah.
Of like, well, this is just easy and it's going to help with their acne, or it's going to help with their menstrual cramps or menstrual experience. Be educated, do the hard work of not just passive, everybody's doing it, so we're going to do it.
Yeah.
So that's all I'll say about that. Go do your research. If you're gonna make that decision, go do your research. To focus on the reproductive side of things, it's hard for me to envision, it gets back to that conflicted, right? Yeah. Like, I'm gonna put you on birth control because I know you're having sex, but I don't want you to be having sex.
Yeah.
But I don't want to be raising your baby, so.
Right.
And we've talked about, we've at least I've imagined today, what is happening in those conflictual family systems around messages of sexuality. And does it actually create crevices where there's more trauma, more mistrust, more pain that takes root and grows? So my question to the parent, if they were in my office, I would say, so tell me, now it gets back to this idea of enabling that we've talked about in previous podcasts, right? You're enabling something that you desire to not be happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Now the medical industry is enabling, because at 14, your daughter can ask you to leave the room and she can procure her own Yaz or whatever she's going to go on.
Yeah.
Right, which is a tragedy, by the way. Right, I'll probably catch some flack for that or heat for that. It's a tragedy that as a parent of a child, I don't care if they're 14.
Yeah.
Right, that what else can they ask you to leave the room for?
Yeah.
Very few things. Typically it involves birth control and abortion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's something fascinating in that. If it has to be that secretive that parents are being asked to leave the room. Sexual stewardship doesn't end when your daughter turns 14 or son turns 14.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? But it does introduce this tension all of a sudden in the home of now I have in my body something that's going to inhibit the consequences. We haven't even talked about how the realm of human sexuality, maybe some of that drive toward unidirectional drive is really, post-sexual evolution. It's all about avoidance and aversion to consequences. I can do what I want, as much as I want, with whomever I want, with no consequences.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the birth control thing we have to put in that frame of reference of, is this a way to mitigate or avoid some consequences? And if that's the driver, that's why we're using that. Especially in the context, you asked about a teenage daughter, right? That's going to introduce conflict. And why would a parent be permissive about something that they disagree with?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Especially in a context where an adolescent, a teenager, right, like already has ability, unfortunately, to go and access that type of medical care for her without parental consent in our current environment.
Yeah.
So
And there are so many things parents have to deal with.
it really is overwhelming.
I do want to kind of wind it up with just helping parents know that if you have this conversation with your kids around any of it, because all of it requires connection, attachment, bonds, and parents, don't give up. Just don't give up because your kid has some kind of resistance. Even, you sit down to have the sex talk, or, the beginning one, the originating, hey, I want to be more involved, and here's, Dad, I don't want to talk to you about all this. At that point, if that happens, I want to give some tools to the parent to be able to lean back into their child and say, no, and be differentiated from your child so that you can, at that moment, not feel like that you got to fix it and not feel like that you have to receive a wound because they don't want to just be able to laugh about it and say, I know it's a big topic, it's crazy, but I am curious why you don't want to talk about it, because I think that reflects on the bigger part of our relationship. And what can we do to heal that part of our relationship where you trust, you feel safe, you feel connected, that I then could be a God-ordained, because biblically I'm supposed to be the one who trains you up in the admonition of the Lord. This would be included in that training and admonition.
Absolutely.
So what can we do to work on our relationship now? Let's be intentional so that you feel safe and you feel like that I'll do the work. I'll read the books. I'll watch, the things I need to watch. I'll get on the podcast at Red Ink Revival, and I'll learn the things I need to learn. But I need to know where our relationship is broken down, because that's a bigger issue for us. So then, after we deal with that, then let's come back to this talk about sexuality, and let's just go there. Let's just begin a journey, and nothing's off the table. Let's talk about it. Do you have any closing thoughts on that before we dismiss and hook up next time?
Yeah, I think that so much of what comes to mind as you say that is the fact that technology has provided our kids with the opportunity to compartmentalize their lives and to build experience without us present.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the resistance, is they don't know how to integrate. Because most of us haven't been talking to our kids long enough, and they've gotten all this other messaging. And even if we are talking to our kids about sex, just the sheer inundation, the sheer frequency, and how it's seeking them out and finding them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? That our voice can't compete with the frequency of messaging that's there. Yeah. And yet when we draw on that relational dynamic, there's an authority in our voice. And I would just encourage people to know that you're the parent.
Yes.
And even if they don't want to talk about it, that's fine. You don't have to talk, but you can listen. Right? I'm going to share with you things that I know are of importance. I know are God honoring. Yeah. Here is, right, to at least plant those seeds. Even if the kid's like, you know what, I don't care, I hate you. Right, that you're still putting seed down in that soil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Doesn't matter if it's rocky. Doesn't matter if it's choked with weeds or hardened. Continue to throw the seed.
Yeah, and then throw at the end of that the question, so how did you understand what I said?
Yeah.
Give me feedback on what you thought I was saying.
Yeah.
And because you are pulling them into it.
Yeah, or build on that, what do you know? What can you add to our conversation?
Yeah.
Right, you be the expert for a second.
Yes.
Right, what's it like to be 15 and dating and the pressures of sexting, right? Legally we look at sexting as the backseat of the Volkswagen.
Yeah.
Or Volvo, or pickup truck, or whatever.
Yeah.
Jalopy, I don't know. But right, that there's just a new space where sexuality is being made sense of and understood, right? We haven't talked about sexting. That could be a whole podcast in of itself.
Yeah.
But finding ways to allow our kids to speak to their experience once we've kind of tilled the soil and tried to aerate and allow things to breathe, so that then they can be the experts, right?
Todd, I love these conversations. So good. So next time we will think through what we want to do for our upcoming episodes. It feels like we just keep pulling off the lid of possibilities, and but great conversation. Thank you.
And if there's a way for listeners to maybe create a feedback loop and let us know where life is at, if there's something thematic that is showing up for listeners to the podcast, I would love to kind of spend our time reaching into whatever wounds or distress or discomfort or awkwardness or whatever's there for listeners. I would just,
it'd be awesome.
Would love to hear from them and know what we can be doing to stay in a space of speaking directly to what they need. We've cast a broad net, and it's important to do that, but now I think to drill down into specific points of pain that might exist, that's why we're here. We're here to help.
Awesome.